We say this often on this show. When Trump shows you who he is, believe him the first time. Now, 3 Republican generals, supported by more than a dozen former Trump aides, are echoing that same warning less than 10 days before one of the most consequential elections this country has ever seen, certainly the most consequential in our lifetime. Their voices carry a weight that is hard to ignore, not only because of their military and government credentials, but because of the collective alarm that they are sounding. It's worth remembering that the only thing that stopped Donald Trump from living out his authoritarian fantasies during his first term was a selfless cadre of lawyers and Republican staffers who went to great lengths to resist his dangerous demands. This time, should Trump return to power, those people won't be there. Those human guardrails will be gone, replaced with a Project 2025 vision, a conservative blueprint calling for the replacement of 50,000 civil servants with loyalists who will do Trump's bidding. My next guest, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Anne Applebaum, observes that Trump's recent escalation in authoritarian rhetoric is both deliberate and unprecedented, writing, quote, with less than 3 weeks left to go, most candidates would be fighting for the middle ground, for the swing voters. Trump is doing the exact opposite. Why? There can be only one answer. Because he and his campaign team believe that by using the tactics of the 1930s, they can win. The deliberate dehumanization of whole groups of people, the references to police, to violence, to the bloodbath that Trump has said will unfold if he doesn't win, the cultivation of hatred not only against immigrants, but also against political opponents. None of this has been used successfully in modern American politics, but neither has this rhetoric been tried in modern American politics. Several generations of American politicians have assumed that American voters, most of whom learned to pledge allegiance to the flag in school, grew up with the rule of law and have never experienced occupation or invasion, would be resistant to this kind of language and imagery. Trump is gambling, knowingly and cynically, that we are not, end quote. For more on this, I'm joined by the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Anne Applebaum. She's a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of numerous books, including her most recent, Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. Anne, thank you for being here. It is so important. I look, in the 10 days you got, if you want to read books, read Anne Applebaum's books, because you have studied how this all happens around the world. And there are constant references that you and Tim Snyder and Ruth Ben-Ghiat and others will make on our show to the 1930s in Europe, in Germany in particular, where people thought it can't go that wrong. But the cynical politics worked then, and sadly and alarmingly, it may be working today.
Yes, no, I think it's really important to start with this word fascist, because, I mean, I think, unfortunately, it creates a connotation of stormtroopers and Holocaust and Hitler that's a little misleading. Nowadays, in the modern world, most autocrats are democratically elected. And then once they come to power, they begin to dismantle the state. They take advantage of their office. They take over bureaucracy. They take over institutions. And in the United States, they could take over the Department of Justice. And they systematically begin to dismantle things, regardless of the rule of law. And what Trump is telling us by using the language of I can use the army, I can do whatever I want, my opponents aren't human, they're vermin, they're enemies. He's telling us that that's what he's planning to do. He's offering us a blueprint. And as you said in your introduction, he's doing so because he thinks that a part of the population wants to hear that. And they want these instant solutions, use violence, whatever, do whatever you can, fix everything. And that's exactly what he's appealing to.
What's the it? Because whether it's Mussolini or Hitler or more modern wars that we're seeing or in Rwanda, what's the it that he's promising disgruntled people that the solution will be authoritarianism, dictatorship, and perhaps the use of the military? I mean, these are things that we normally, when we look at problems in America, we like to believe that there are political solutions to them. And he is suggesting something else.
He's suggesting, and this is the autocratic narrative that you'll hear from Russia. You'll hear a version from it from China. This is described in my book, actually. Lots of other autocrats do the same. He's trying to describe autocracy as stable and safe. I will fix everything for you. I'm the leader. I'm the embodiment the will of the nation. This is the element that we have from the 1930s. I can fix everything, and then you won't have to worry anymore. You won't even, sometimes even hinted, you won't even have to vote anymore.
Yep.
I'm going to fix it. And that, for some people, in a world that is genuinely confusing, and especially in a world where all kinds of different information comes in all day long, it's contradictory, there are conspiracy theories, there's a lot of emotion online, offering people this sense of stability is what he's trying to do. And he's trying to appeal to people who feel overburdened by modernity, who dislike the fast rate of change, who dislike demographic change, social change, economic change, and just want one leader. And that is the kind of language that has worked in turbulent places at other times in other places. Notice another thing. When he's making these calls, he's at the same time describing America, as he used the expression, garbage can.
Yep.
America is chaos. America is hell. You know, it's being destroyed. So he's creating the picture for people that there is this horrific chaos, this carnage that he can come in and fix. And I think that's what he's doing to appeal to. That's the group of people who want to hear that kind of language. That's what he's trying to appeal to.
With 10 days to go in this election, it's important that voters understand that a point you made, that generally speaking, in modern times, fascists, dictators, and authoritarians do not come to power through revolution. They come to power because voters in their vote give them a permission structure to do the things that they're going to say. There is zero reason to believe that Donald Trump will not do the things that he's threatening to do. Right? I mean, why would you not? If you're voting for him.
I mean, he's certainly preparing the ground to break the law. He's implying that, you know, he would have the right to do it, that he would have the, you know, he would have the popular support to do it. He's implying that he's somehow above the law. You know, when he suggests, for example, as you said in your introduction, when he suggests that he could use the military against civilians, that his enemies are non-citizens, that he doesn't have to give them any rights, he doesn't have to treat them as human even. I mean, that's all. That is a kind of preparation. It's preparing people to accept a breaking of the rules if that's what he does. And you're also right to point out that in his first term in office, he had people around him who were stopping him. I mean, we had people saying, you know, we used to take papers off his desk. We used to prevent him from doing things. I had John Bolton in an interview I did with him describe to me how he was once on the way to a NATO summit, and he suddenly turned to Bolton. Trump turned to Bolton and said, let's make history. Let's move out of NATO today. Let's quit. And Bolton, of course, talked him out of it, and Jim Mattis talked him out of it. But will those people be around in the second term? Probably not. Most of them have resigned. Many of them have come out against Trump. Many of them have been very vocal about their fears. And he will be surrounded by a different kind of person, by somebody who will enable these authoritarian impulses that he has prepared at least a part of the nation to accept.
And thank you again for your great writing and your great insight. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer at The Atlantic. She's the author of multiple very, very important books. And if you're looking for some important reads in the next 10 days, Autocracy, Inc., Dictators Who Want to Run the World.